I asked for a sign from God. 12 red roses in full bloom in the evening of the 9th day, if he's calling. And lo and behold, after about 10 minutes of silent prayer, this vase of 12 red roses in full bloom just appeared.
When did you end up in Rome? You live in Rome.
I've been to Rome a couple of times. Both times was just through my vow of obedience. I said yes, blank check, whatever, whenever, however. And God has a great sense of humor. So I've been living in Rome since 2008.
Hi, this is Ryan Millsap. Welcome to the Blackhall Podcast. Today on the podcast, we have a wonderful opportunity to hear from a friend of mine, Father Thomas Montanaro, who happens to be visiting from Rome. He's in the United States for a few weeks. And on this podcast, we get to talk about his faith journey, his journey toward being a priest. We touch on some of the spirituality around seeking to hear the voice of God. And at the end, he offers us a wonderful blessing. I think you'll enjoy this podcast. I hope you'll come on the journey with us and enjoy it. Well, welcome to the Blackhall Podcast. I'm Ryan Millsap, and I'm here with my special guest, Father Thomas Montanaro, who is a friend of mine from Rome. He happens to be coming through the United States on a number of stops, and he stopped in Atlanta, and I asked him if he'd be willing to do a podcast, and he said absolutely. So, Father Thomas, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Ryan. Blessing to be here.
We're glad you're here. Tell us a little bit about the journey that led you to decide to become a priest.
Wow, that's a question.
Isn't it? Right? It had to start somewhere. I mean, take us back to a little bit, like maybe even in your youth when you started to even contemplate that possibility, and then, lead us on that journey.
Yeah, thanks. I love when people offer this question, Ryan. Every vocation is totally different. And in my case, I think I had an inkling that God was calling me, but I really was not interested in listening. In fact, I was an altar server when I was young, grew up in a Catholic family. 3rd grade, a nickname in our class was, for me, the future priest of America. That was what the priest or the teacher of the class would call me. And all of the girls would come up in the class and they'd say, "Why did you want to be a priest?" And I said, "Don't get the wrong idea. I don't." And, it was natural in my family to be around priests. We had priests that were friends, but I wasn't really looking for that style of life. Looking to have a family and get married and, yes, be a saint, be a good holy man, but not in the priesthood. So fast forward, went through college, felt that God was calling me be more generous with him in college. And I said, you know what, I'll give a year as a volunteer after I do my undergrad. And during that year, I recognized that I was afraid that God might be calling me. So that was the beginning of the inklings. And, I asked for a sign from God. I did a novena to Saint Therese of Lisieux, a French saint. She died when she was 24 years old. She said, "I'll be busy in heaven doing a lot of things, sending down roses for those that ask me." And I'd heard about this saint. I'd, read her autobiography, The Story of a Soul. And I prayed to her and I said, I need a sign. I need clarity if God's calling me to be a priest. My heart's not there. But I'm open if God wants to call me. And I just need, as a sign, 12 red roses in full bloom in the evening of the 9th day, if he's calling. And I didn't tell anyone about this prayer that I made. It was between me and God and this saint up in heaven. And the 9th day just happened to be down in New Orleans, Louisiana. And I was in a family home. They had a little chapel in their home. And lo and behold, after about 10 minutes of silent prayer, I opened my eyes. And even though there was nothing in front of me, no one in front of me, no one came or left while I was there, this vase of 12 red roses in full bloom just appeared. And I said, "Oh no."
Why'd you say, "Oh no"?
My plans were going in a totally opposite direction. And this was really the moment of choice, the moment of asking what God had made me for and recognizing that my desires until that moment were going in a different direction. My fears, in a certain sense, were unveiled. And yeah, I was like a deer in headlights at that crossroads of life. And you'll remember this poem, right? When two roads diverged in a wood. And that was the moment when I had to choose which one. And that's really made all the difference.
So when did you switch from fear to excitement? about the priesthood?
So it's difficult for me to recognize if there was a minute, 5 minutes, or 10 minutes when I was at that crossroads in life. But at that particular moment in that same place, the small little chapel, I felt and I experienced God's voice, not like a physical voice, but inside of me, I felt his voice. And he told me, you know what, Tom, I've made you to be a priest. And you'll only be fully happy in this life as a priest, but you're also totally free to pick a different path. You won't be fully happy in another path, but you're also totally free to do so. You choose. And I took a second, and when I recognized that I was free and that it wasn't forcing me to do anything, I said, well, who else can I trust more than the one who's created me? And that was the mustard seed, I would say. It was the mustard seed of that change from fear into joy, into love, into embracing. And it took a while I was going through the different steps of the things that I had to leave, and then as well getting to know the one who was calling me. So it wasn't immediate, but it was a mustard seed that began at that moment. And I said, hey, let's go. All in.
How long after the appearance of the roses did you admit to anybody else what had happened?
Great question. I actually don't remember. I had not told anyone about this prayer, and I was doing a team of volunteer service, so I was with another young man. His name was Matt. Probably told him a few days afterwards. Probably told my spiritual coach, spiritual director, as well, maybe a couple of weeks afterwards when I went by where my spiritual director was living at the time. But it wasn't immediate. It was something that was between me and God, and I was trying to unwrap that and figure out what that meant for me.
When you decide that you want to go on the journey to be a priest, what's the first step? Like practically, what's the first step? I mean, let's say that there's somebody who's listening to this, who's praying to God, saying, am I supposed to be a priest? And God says to them, go be a priest. What's the first step you take to try to be a priest?
Well, I would say go talk to a priest. And there's so many different ways of living out the vocation, but a priest is a great person who's had the experience himself personally, who can help someone to discern or unwrap this call that God has planted in his soul. So talking to a priest, recognizing as well with time how to discern and understand that particular vocation within this general call to be a priest. There's diocesan priests, there's religious priests, there's a ton of different orders that are out there. And we're made for one particular life, but a priest would have usually the sufficient capacity to help a young man to discern or to know who that particular priest is in a particular geographical location to be able to also do that, accompany this young man. There's usually a vocational director in different dioceses. Different orders as well have spiritual directors and vocational directors. If someone was interested, for example, in our order and our different geographical locations and countries, I'd say go do a vocational retreat and talk to somebody there in that vocational retreat.
What would a vocational retreat be?
Usually it's a weekend, and you've got a bunch of young men that are open to the possibility of God calling. Maybe they've had an inclination and they believe that that's the case, but they're not 100% sure. So it's basically a time to pray with other like-minded individuals under the guidance of an experienced priest to be able to go into this mystery of the call. And maybe they don't come out of these 3 days with total clarity, but maybe there's sufficient clarity for taking another step, which might be another vocational retreat, or some activities of social service and different types of ministry together with a priest.
So once you know, like at least we've gone through, let's say for you did your prayer, you see the roses, you maybe continue to unravel some of this stuff. But then once you're on the road, what does the road to being a priest look like? Seminaries involved? What is that road? What is that path? What are the steps?
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. Well, depending on which path you decide to take, whether it's a diocesan priest life or a religious priest life.
And tell us the difference, because a lot of people listening aren't Catholic.
Yeah, beautiful. So diocesan priest would generally be a pastor of a parish, a church that you'd have in any different place. You were out in LA at a particular moment, so you go downtown, you might see the glass cathedral that's there. Usually the cathedrals and different churches that are in different places have a diocesan priest, a priest who gives himself to service locally in a particular geographical location under the authority of the bishop of that particular place. A religious priest, on the other hand, is someone who enters into what we call religious life. So different than a diocesan priest necessarily, he lives in community with other priests or brothers. He also takes vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And sometimes they can be public religious orders, or they could be closed, or like hermits, Carthusians, or others that dedicate themselves to contemplative prayer. So contemplative or active life. The religious priests, to make things a little bit more complicated, they could also be parish priests. So they might ask the Franciscans or the Jesuits, in a particular diocese like, say, Brooklyn, New York, hey, can you take on this parish? They've done that to us as well in Rome. We have a parish, Our Lady of Guadalupe, and so sometimes you'll have an order that also runs a parish. But generally speaking, the distinctions are these: the authority underneath the bishop to serve parish church, and then as well a religious living in community, living out vows with a particular mission and a way of living the gospel message. Myself, for example, as a Legionary of Christ priest, we take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. We take a fourth vow as well, which sometimes is common in a religious order, which is not to look for ourselves or for anyone else in our order, any places or positions of authority or of power. So we just vow to serve, and that's it. And so different orders have a different spirituality taste or bent to them, a charism to live out the gospel message. And like when you're looking for a spouse, discerning in that sense, you see, well, what way of life, what vocation, what style of living out the priesthood is meant for me.
Where's my tribe?
Totally.
So there's priests that are not part of an order, and the order would be like a monastic order. There are priests who are part of a monastic order. My understanding, there are monks who are part of monastic orders, but they're not priests. Mm-hmm. Am I tracking?
Totally.
And is that kind of how it plays out? Like you got the priests, no order, priests who have an order, monks who have an order, but they're not part of the priesthood.
Totally. And I'm sure you'll have other theologians that'll get into different specifications, but generally speaking, if you're a brother or a monk who is not a priest, generally you're in religious life. There's an example that's out there is really commonly known, St. Francis of Assisi. He started this order called the Franciscans. And at the same time, he himself was not a priest. He always was a brother. He felt called to serve God, but he didn't feel worthy to be a priest. And so he just was there as someone that served. So a brother, religious brother, very, very common in different orders. And my order, for example, the Legion of Christ, we only have transitional brothers, which is to say we don't have any monks that stably or brothers that stably remain as brothers or as monks. All of them are on the way to the priesthood. And so depending on which order you're at, some might be locked in for those that are candidates to the priesthood, and other ones would have brothers or monks that would serve.
Okay, so now let's get back to kind of the process of becoming a priest. Because I think it's interesting to me. I know enough about it to be dangerous, but I think it's interesting to anybody who's listening to this particular podcast is going to be interested in this question, which is how many years does it take? What kind of things do you study? What are the major kind of waypoints? And then when are you actually a priest?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. Depending on where you enter, whether it's in Los Angeles, New York, whether it's in the Franciscans or the Legionaries of Christ, can be very, very different, this whole process. So I'll speak of what I know of, which is in my order, and I know it a little bit better. Now, our process on average would take about 12 years. In general, and other orders, it could be a little bit shorter. Sometimes, it could be a little bit longer, but I think on average, we're a little bit longer in comparison to other ways of living out the call to the priesthood. So what does that, make up 12 years? How do you, go through those different steps? Well, the first 2 years, actually, let's back it up. The first 3 months are a period called the candidacy, and it's kind of like a prolonged vocational retreat. So the men that think that they want to enter the religious life, they get a 3-month trial period. After which they do 8 days of silent retreat. And if after those 8 days of silent retreat, they desire to enter into the first 2 years of religious life, then they enter what we call a novitiate. So the novitiate, these young men will take promises, not yet vows, but promises to live out for a couple of years the style of life in our order. We call the novitiate like the university where you study Christ. So it's a time of a ton of prayer, of learning the style of life in our order, going through the spirituality, the different types of traditions within our order, and giving it a try. So it's kind of like, I would say, maybe an engagement period, if you were to make an analogy.
Novitiate in Latin, I believe, means beginner.
That's right.
Right. So you're just labeled. You're like a freshman.
That's right. That's right. You're not a full-fledged member.
A pledge.
That's
you're
right.
A pledge.
We have many hopes in those that are novices, but at the same time, not all of them make the cut.
Fair enough. Okay. So 2 years of beginner work. Mm-hmm. And then what comes next?
If God continues to call these individuals.
Because at any time you can opt out.
That's right.
Right. They're trying, some of it's a weeding out process, no different than any other very, very serious profession. I mean, the Navy SEALs have to go through Hell Week because they just want to weed out as many people as they can because they know that what comes next is going to be like very serious and very hard. And so they're just trying to like make sure that they're getting those people out early.
Totally. Now, we don't have a bell like they have in the Navy SEALs. We're not motivating them to ring the bell or to get out. But definitely there's an environment of freedom and no one's forced to stay. And at the same time, what we'll look to desire is that there's a mutual or a double or a parallel discernment of the individual to see if he feels called and not only feels, but recognizes interiorly if he's called by God. And then as well, the order also recognizes and discerns, is this particular person called from our perspective? So this double discernment happens within the context of freedom.
It's beautiful. It's like everything in life. Mm-hmm. But just boiled down to what happens when you have a bunch of people who, for generations, have tried to find other people who have a calling to serve. So it makes perfect sense that the order would have discernment, and the individual would have to feel it too.
Totally. So there could be on one side the individual might say, "No, not interested," while the order says, "No, well, you're a great candidate." And that might put him into a period of crisis where he has to recognize, well, am I just not being generous? Or do I really believe that God's calling me to a different path? And vice versa. So it's a period which is really beautiful of discernment. And towards the end of that period, there's a handful of important interviews where the congregation, in this case, my order, will have a couple of major superiors, and they'll interview the candidates. And they'll recognize, well, what are your intentions as we go forward? And there's a handful of different steps that church law asks us for to make sure that the candidates, that they have a sane and a balanced psychology, that they have the capacity to live out the style of life as well. They don't have other responsibilities. They're not married, for example, and they've got kids. They don't have these types of responsibilities. So there's this interview. And if the candidate is interested, and if he makes as well a desire formally to be able to go forward, then he goes through another process of another spiritual exercises or 8-day silent retreat, after which he makes his first vows within the church, which are a period of 3 years. So not only promises like the first 2 years, but he becomes a religious, so to speak, right? He's left behind the trial period, even though the first period of 3 years of vows is still a temporary period. So
you're making a 3-year contract.
That's right.
That your vows are a 3-year set of vows.
That's right.
I mean, this is pretty genius, actually.
Yeah. Imagine if we would do that in our dating relationships.
I mean, in your friendships and your everything. Like if you say, you know what, let's vow to be friends for 2 years and see what happens.
Yeah. And, we recognize, and the church above all recognizes, that this relationship between the soul and God, between an individual and God, it's not always crystal clear. And so why do we have such a long time? Well, it's to be able to make sure that the individual has the capacities and as well as responding to a call from God. Somebody might have all the qualities, but not be responding to a call. And it takes time as well to be able to recognize that. So
now we're 5 years in.
5 years in. We've got, during these 3 years, usually, at least in our order, the individuals, they'll go on to do humanities studies. That is generally 2 years. Could be 1 year, but it's generally 2 years of humanities studies. And so we're talking about history, philosophy, a little bit of theology, but not too much. We're talking about Greek, Latin, art, public speaking. And so general overview of the humanities. Wonderful formation that not all orders have. This is something which is a really huge blessing, I would say, in our case, of the Legion of Christ. So 2 years.
But to this point, basically no theology.
That's right. During the first 2 years, there's a little bit, right, of catechism, a bit as well of the teachings of the church, the whole organism of the spiritual life. So you do definitely dabble, and part of our life is in our relationship with God. So there's definitely an underlying tone of different aspects, but we wait for the theology formally until the end of the formation, right before ordination.
Well, what I was thinking was that how thoughtful, intelligent it is that you spend those first 2 years really doing spiritual exercise, getting spiritual direction, and then the things you're studying are really more in line with spiritual direction and personal connection to God. And maybe you're studying saints that have come before you, but you're probably studying how they interacted with God.
Mm-hmm. Totally.
Right. And not getting into any sort of like systematic theology.
That's correct. The systematic part will wait for a bit further down the road. Now, some, like myself, had studied a bit of theology before entering, and you'll have conversations. You might go, through with different professors and colleagues and candidates as well. But yeah, the systematic part waits until after our philosophy studies.
Well, and clearly you're allowed to go study whatever you want, right? If you're curious about whatever kind of theology, you can go study all that on your own, just like you could go study history, philosophy. What's interesting to me about the process is they're trying to figure out what kind of soul you are and what your orientation is with God and what you're hearing from God and what they're hearing from God about you. Mm-hmm. So it's not that it's not intellectual. It's just not concerned with being intellectual because it's much more concerned with the heart and the soul. That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah, well, so maybe I'll explain a little bit about this. Our model of formation, which we believe is not unbalanced or only one focused, one faceted at the beginning and then another faceted at the end. But we really look to have an integral formation throughout the whole process. So I would say it's definitely intellectual from the beginning. But at the same time, the principal focus within an intellectual, a human, an apostolic, as well as a spiritual formation is that spiritual formation mm-hmm. during the first 2 years. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. To really have this relationship and learn, for example, the language of God. Mm-hmm. I don't know how many different languages you yourself speak, Ryan, right?
I wouldn't even admit to more than one.
Okay.
I mean, I speak some Spanish and I speak some Russian, and my Spanish is better than my Russian, but neither of those I would consider to be so good that it'd be a second language.
Sure. Well, I guess you have at least this experience of learning a different language. I'm sure Russian is very, very different than Spanish.
Mm-hmm. It's closer to Greek.
See, totally. And in the same way, God has a different language. And so leaving these first 2 years definitely in a rigorous way to be able to discern how God speaks to me, how his language is. He can use silence. He can use actions. He can use nature. He can use so many different things. Someone that says something to me who's dear to me, someone who's a stranger as well that makes a gesture, and God can speak through that. And so these first 2 years to discern as well how God is speaking to me. Our relationship in that sense is definitely a relational relationship. This is pretty redundant, but at the same time, the call to the priesthood and also in our religious order, it's always the response and a response to a person who loves us. And so these first 2 years definitely to get into who is this person who calls me and who I'm responding to. So integrally, we're looking to be formed, and at the same time, where this is a university to learn Christ, further down the road, we'll get into the systematic part in theology.
Sure. What the other thing that's interesting as you're telling the story is I'm thinking about how often it is that the thing that turns people off, just lay people off to organized religion, is often systematic theology, where if the organized religious approach to education about the religious life was maybe more oriented in this same way, where they say, listen, theology is a speculation for later. Right now, it's just about trying to figure out how to hear the voice of God. Mm-hmm. And if that orientation was adapted, it might open the doors to more people being open. Because I think yoga and the East and Buddhist practice and all these things oftentimes is stealing very earnest people that are very interested in hearing the voice of God, because it feels like that might be a more readily accessible path. And oftentimes, like I think our Western, well, all of our Christian institutions oftentimes feel daunting. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. but hearing this process is, I think, something that a lot of people would find personally intriguing, even if they're not trying to be a priest, but they're just if they're trying to figure out what it means to know God and hear the voice of God.
Yeah, I totally agree, Ryan. I think, in our catechism classes, sometimes, at least I speak from my own experience in the Catholic Church, sometimes we can be focused too much on what the norms are and a little bit less about who the person is. And, there's a beautiful story of a friend of mine. She's a catechism teacher. She brings these young kids, and I don't know if it's 3rd or 4th grade, but she brings them through. And before she starts to teach about the different norms of the faith or the precepts of the faith, she brings them into a chapel and she says, let's kneel down for a second and have a time of prayer. And she leads them in this prayer. And this happens in a Catholic church down in Florida where this young woman is teaching. And then afterwards, after they have about 5-7 minutes of prayer, she brings the kids into the classroom. And the first thing she does, again, before teaching them precepts and what we believe, she asks the kids, what was your experience in the chapel when we were praying? One of the kids responds, I went in heavy and I came out light. Another kid responds, I just felt at peace. Another one said, I felt safe. So these are feelings. These are perhaps intuitions as well with this relationship. But for me, it was a beautiful model of something that we can do more in our communities and in our different places, which is to teach how to relate to God. And from this relationship, when I have that relationship, then everything else follows. If I could take a second to tell a story.
Please.
A friend of mine who I visited the other day in Houston, and he was a professed atheist for a handful of years. Medical doctor, very intelligent man, great grasp on reality, a very charitable man as well. And he had a lot of different questions and holdups about the Catholic faith, which after about 5 years of friendship started to ask. But it was a particular moment when he was in a church accompanying his wife, who was a believer in a Catholic church. And he was just sitting there in the pews of the church, and he was looking up at the crucifix. And he wasn't yet a believer. But as he was sitting there, non-provoking, without provoking anything else, he just had this overflow of experience of love. And the way that he expressed to me just a couple of days ago, he said, Father, I knew exactly in that moment that it was God and I was an atheist and that I had a call to respond to him. And I desired to do that and to make the rest of my life responding to this experience of love that I had. Anyway, responding to a person who loves me, for me, this is the basis and the foundation in our Christian faith. Hopefully, all of us can do that and so grow in a beautiful response, beautiful relationship.
Yeah, I think of spirituality as the process of trying to hear the voice of God. And then I think of theology as people who have heard the voice of God and engaged in a relationship with God, trying to explain what that relationship is in, intellectual, philosophical, logical, narrative terms. And it's very difficult to try to define life with God theologically, I believe. But I absolutely love this approach of the relational first, the foundations of society second, and then the theology comes much later, where you get into the technical exploration of all the ways people have tried to explain things. All right, so we've finished year 5. We've now gotten a foundation in humanities. We've gotten a little deeper into philosophy, probably. We've studied more of the history of the church. We probably know a lot more about not just our own order, but a lot of the other orders. And we've completed our 3-year vow, and now we got to decide whether they're going to renew the contract.
Yes.
So what comes next?
Yeah, so similar process, Ryan, to this passage from the first 2 years with promises to the passage with vows. It's a little bit easier because the gentlemen that have arrived, these brothers, religious brothers, they have already made a commitment to God, and they have to recognize, has this call continued? Have I had further clarity if it's been God's will and his call that I've been following? And if so, I continue that in a dialogue with the spiritual director, and as well with a formal petition to be able to renew usually vows for another 3 years, during which time philosophy studies are done, about 3 years to do a bachelor's degree in philosophy. And then as well, after these philosophy studies, there's also what we call an apostolic internship, again, within our order. So it's a time to be able to see, do I have what it takes as well in the field, in contact with different individuals, whether it's in higher education or in youth groups, in my own culture or a different culture, if I'm able to live out as well this life of service for others. So as part of this discernment, okay, yeah, I've got maybe the intellectual knowledge, think I've got what it takes. Can I live out some way of the apostolate or the ministry in real life? And that'll usually be 1 or 2 years of apostolic internship, could be 3 or 4 as well. Enough time to see if that individual has as well an experience of the ministry in our religious life. After which time, you got to discern what comes afterwards. And this is the final discernment generally to pass along for what would be final vows or perpetual vows.
Perpetual vows. Sounds like a wedding.
Yes, totally. Well, yeah, even more so, I would say. Mm-hmm. Even more so. Before perpetual vows, we don't just do an 8-day silent retreat. Now we do a full-fledged 30-day silent retreat to help the individuals to really go deep with themselves in prayer, with our Lord, and then also with the help of a spiritual mentor, a spiritual guide, to help them to discern if they're willing and desiring to respond as well to a call to give the rest of their lives in this life as well as in eternity as one of God's religious.
30 days of silence.
Are you interested?
I mean, that's a lot of silence. I'm interested just in the sense that I've done maybe 24 hours of silence. I think I did one retreat that was 24 hours of silence. I've done some pretty lonely retreats, like 3, 4, or 5 day, but where there's interaction around eating, or maybe there's maybe there's no talking at lunch, but then there's talking at dinner. So variations. But that sounds, is it truly 30 days of silence, or is it intermittent silence?
Yeah, great question. So cutting to the chase, right? There are different moments when we do speak. For example, even daily, there's community prayers. Mm-hmm. So I'm not in total or absolute silence. But I'm not looking to have an interaction or a conversation with other individuals outside of perhaps a spiritual director or a guide that's there that's guiding us. There's directed meditation, so I'm listening to someone speak. And as well, maybe once a day, I might have a 5 to 10 minute interview with one of the spiritual guides to explain how the Spirit's moving within me and receive as well a little bit more tailor-made or tailor-fit indications of how to go forward in these spiritual exercises. Usually, in the classic scheme of the 30 days, which we follow St. Ignatius of Loyola, the author really of these spiritual exercises, there's a day of rest. And so there's a 4-week segment, not necessarily all of 7 days, but anyway, 4 different sections of prayer, in the middle of which there's 1 day of rest. And so with the same individuals that are there on retreat, we take a day of walking through perhaps the fields or walking up a mountain, a day of rest and of interaction as well among the individuals. So yeah, it's not pure silence, but at the same time, it's not
a lot
for
of
everyone.
silence. It's a lot of silence.
Yes.
But that makes sense because you still have some guidance. You still can ask some questions, maybe receive some direction, have some interaction with other people. You're not just isolated. It's not like a 5-day retreat in the mountains of a cave by yourself in the dark. It's
That's right.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, they don't take on those manifestations. But at the same time, for example, Ryan, we sit down for a meal, I'm not going to be making jokes with whoever is sitting in front of me. So we might be listening to a spiritual reading, maybe listening as well to some music that helps us to as well enter into the mystery that we're contemplating and meditating.
Yeah, so much of trying to hear the voice of God is stripping away all the noise that gets in the way of it.
Totally. And if I could say through personal experience, I didn't start with a 30-day silent retreat or retreat spiritual exercises. My first one, I think, was maybe half a day or a long weekend. And that's a great way to start as well for all of those that are listening that perhaps have never had this experience of silence. Such a beautiful experience. I can still remember today, the first weekend that I did when I was in college. And just about a day and a half. Friday afternoon we started, all day Saturday, and then the morning of the Sunday. And I was so passionate about this experience afterwards. I had to share it with everyone. And it was an experience of God, of recognizing that he was speaking to me. So anyway, start with something which is short and go from there.
Well, we're talking about a 30-day silent retreat after, if my math is right, somewhere around 8 to 10 years of preparation where you've been contemplating, exploring, getting deeper into the priesthood, and now you're kind of at this moment of decision, and you go on a 30-day retreat, and then do you come out of that retreat and make a decision, or what comes next? Yeah,
so great question, Ryan. Eventually you make the decision. Originally, the spiritual exercises that St. Ignatius of Loyola developed was to be able to help an individual to make a definitive decision for life. So they were designed for that. And it's a time of prayer to be able to listen to God, to see clearly, and then as well to activate your will and say, how am I going to respond? What am I going to do? So ideally, yes, with the help of a spiritual director, you come out with a commitment for something or another. And in this particular case, am I going to give, the rest of my life to this style of life, following God, in whichever order that someone's in?
Was Ignatius a Dominican? He was
the founder of the Jesuits.
Jesuits.
Yeah.
That's right. Okay. I wasn't placing it. I knew he wasn't a Benedictine because that was Benedict.
Yes. No, that's right.
Was it the Dominican Dominic who founded the Dominicans?
Yes.
All right. So St. Ignatius was a Jesuit.
That's right.
Started the Jesuits.
And he had a really interesting experience that led him to kind of developing this spiritual exercise, if I can take a second to explain that. He was not a really religious man. He was a rather worldly man. He himself would explain that. And in a particular moment, he was actually in a battle. He was wounded in a battle. They brought him to a hospital, and he was asking for some books to be able to read. And he was looking for novels that were more of chivalry and epic stories. And the only book that they had was The Lives of the Saints and the Bible. And after having spent time reading these different books that were more epic and secular of nature, and comparing it as well to the lives of the saints in the Bible, he recognized that interiorly he felt differently. He was happier more profoundly. It had moved him as well differently. And so he started this whole capacity really scientifically to look at as well, how can you discern the spirits that work in your own life? And he developed a series of rules based on his own experiences. He said, there's a lot of different types of peace out there. There's a peace which is kind of like a Coca-Cola peace, or a joy as well, which is like a Coca-Cola joy. Nothing against Coke.
We're in Atlanta, by the way.
That's right.
Coca-Cola built this town.
That's right. But something that, just opens up and fizzes away in an instant. Whereas there was a more tranquil, perhaps humble peace or joy that he recognized that came out and opened up, so to speak, while he was going through the lives of the saints and the Bible. And he was able to start to make these scientific rules of how the spirit, the worldly spirit or the evil spirit or his own spirit moved, and how the Holy Spirit moved inside of him. So anyway, he had this spiritual experience through his own personal situation that led him to develop these spiritual exercises. Really intriguing. I highly suggest for those that are interested to pick up as well a small little thin book of his spiritual exercises, which are still used today, hundreds of years later. The Spiritual Exercises.
Just called The Spiritual Exercises by Ignatius of Loyola.
That's right.
Did he go through a process? Did he become a priest?
He did eventually. He founded the Jesuits, the order, founded as well and brought together a handful of young men that also felt called to serve God with a certain passion and decision in life. And he was eventually ordained a priest. Yeah.
Well, I mean, obviously the Jesuits have left a incredible set of institutions, including, Georgetown University and, countless others that have educated people, both secular and lay people, or I should say, both priests and lay people, for a long time, and just had profound impact on the world and their both spiritual and intellectual foundations.
Totally. And for me, it's beautiful to see that one particular man that has a spiritual experience that codifies it, so to speak, that makes a scientific structure out of it. He impacts so many people from all different orders. And so I'm on different order, definitely inspired by St. Ignatius. And I think within the church today, he's made a huge impact for helping people to grow in that spiritual experience and relationship, thanks to the spiritual exercises.
What do you think people who are on a path of marriage could learn from this process of becoming a priest before you take forever vows?
Great question, Ryan. Great question. It's actually Pope Francis today, who's also a Jesuit following the same order of St. Ignatius Loyola. A handful of years ago, he came out with a letter where he encouraged couples that were engaged to take a bit longer to get to know one another. Perhaps that would be one of the takeaways that I would offer. You don't have to rush into something, even though you're head over heels. Each one of us are mysteries unto ourselves. And with time, the true self is revealed. And so taking time, not rushing in, getting to know really another person, I think it's a beautiful lesson that we can all take.
Let's just take a moment to shout out to our dear friends, Avi and Jess, who took, I think it was 10 years of dating before they got married.
Wow.
And of course, you got to meet them at their wedding in Rome. And I know they'll listen to this for sure because they love you so much. And they, of course, are a perfect example of people that took a long time. So I know Jess was sometimes frustrated with that amount of time, but obviously Avi had a plan.
Yes.
That was a spiritual plan.
Wow.
To where when he dedicated himself, it was going to be for life.
Wow, that's beautiful. I did not know that it was 10 years, in the making.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't remember that. What a beautiful example. And what a special experience that we had as well, witnessing their marriage there in Rome. And from what I got to know of them, just beautiful individuals looking to serve, help one another, and take a path of love together, of service
There's
together.
no doubt about that. Okay, so You've gone through all this. You do your 30-day retreat. And now let's go to, your life. So you do your 30-day retreat, and then what comes next? When do you take the vows? And how old are you at this point in your life when you're getting ready to take these vows?
Yeah, so in my case, what was I? This was back in, I must have been, I must have been like I was 30 years old.
Oh, so you started at
old.
20. You started this journey at like 20.
That's right.
That's amazing.
Yeah. Usually after those years, you do your theology studies, or you're in the midst of your theology studies. So for me,
before or after the ceremony of like lifelong dedication?
Could be in the middle of it.
Okay.
Usually the guys might come back and do 1 year of theology. Then they get to do the 30 days. For me, I actually did my perpetual vows while I was in my apostolic internship, helping out some novices in Monterrey, Mexico. And so after that, I continued helping out the novices, and then I came back to Rome for theology studies, which were 3 years to do a bachelor's degree in theology.
But at this point, you're not a priest. You just are now a dedicated brother.
Yes.
You're not a novice anymore.
That's right. No, we're just still called brothers. So either with temporal vows or perpetual vows, we're called brothers. But I would say, the perpetual club, right? So you're locked in for life.
You're locked in for life.
Yes.
And what is that ceremony like? Is there a ceremony associated with? I would think.
Yeah. Thank you for asking that. Beautiful ceremony. It's a ceremony during a mass, and so a religious ceremony. And usually all of our community members are there, the priests from the order, many families as well. You have the novices, those that are in temporal vows, and everyone comes together to be able to celebrate. And after the homily or the preaching of the sermon, the individuals are called one by one, and they say their names. They say, "I'm here present. Here I am. Lord, you're calling me. Here I am." And they step towards the altar. They kneel down, and there's a little bit of a dialogue with whatever superior is there. And then each one says their own name and says, "I, before God and before the people that are there, promise and vow to Almighty God to live for my whole life in poverty, chastity, obedience." And then as well, if there's different orders like our own order as well, right? To not look for positions of authority or, for myself or for others. So it's within the Mass. At the end of the Mass, in a certain sense, you could say that the culmination of the Mass, in a certain sense, is receiving communion. So it's saying, I'm responding to you who have called me, and then you who have called me comes to me as well to confirm and to consolidate, or not consolidate, that's a bad word, but to confirm and
to meet me.
Truly. And I would say even to consummate in a certain sense, that relationship. I give myself totally, and he gives himself totally.
There's a passage in Revelation that I've been contemplating for decades now, where it's Revelation 21, and in this chapter, Christ comes flying out of the heavens on a horse, on a white horse. And on his way from the heavens to the earth, the birds all gather and fly with him. This huge group of birds. And Christ says to the birds, "Come with me. Today you will feast on the flesh of kings." And I've been contemplating this notion that we can either feast on the body of Christ, or the birds might feast on our flesh, and what that means. And I've been, I don't know exactly what it means, but I've been imagining and contemplating and thinking about it and dwelling on it for decades now.
Incredible, very profound reflection, Ryan. The book of Revelation, I love it. Extremely profound, very symbolic, and a friend of mine who's a colleague as well, a priest, he's an expert, as a biblicist, and he's really gotten into all of the different symbologies of, the book of Revelation. Now, one of the principles of interpretation of any of the books of the Bible is you can never take one particular phrase out of the context of all of the other ones, which is to say, the principles to be able to interpret as well one particular phrase come as well from other places in the Bibles. And so maybe, a particular inspiration to be able to start to open up this image that we have there in the 21st chapter of Revelation would be in the Gospel of John, traditionally the same author, John and of Revelation. And, Jesus himself, he says, "I'm the bread of life. And if you eat of my flesh, you will never die." Other passages of the Bible, of the Gospels as well, they'll talk about heaven, Jesus himself speaking about heaven, and he calls heaven the eternal wedding banquet of the Lamb, which is an incredible picture, fresco image that's set before us. Heaven as a wedding banquet. What are we eating? The Lamb. Put together with Jesus there in John chapter 6. I myself am the bread of life. And if you eat my flesh, you will never die. Mysteriously feasting on the King of Kings, so to speak, right? Is Jesus himself who offers his own self for our nourishment. And this eternal wedding banquet. Difficult as well, other passages perhaps to interpret the other part of this, if the birds will be feasting upon me. Well, definitely, right, as we began at the beginning, two roads diverged in a wood. Did I take the one more traveled or less traveled? And so definitely there's an option for us to perhaps pick a path which is not the path that we've been made for. And it's not a pretty ending according to the words of our Lord. Definitely we need to pray for one another and make positive actions in this life to follow our conscience, to love, so that we're not feasted upon eternally, as is an option for each one of us.
Well, now you see why I've been contemplating this for so long. But
good for you, Ryan. I really commend you. And do you have a particular insight as well?
I mean, I think a lot of things to say on it, but I'd say that the thing that maybe is most important to me is just to remember that ultimately the only thing that matters for a human being is whether or not God likes us. Because if God doesn't like us, then we don't get to be part of the party. Because he's not going to ruin the party with all the people that he likes with people that he doesn't like. And I say he in a plural sense of they, in the sense that the center of the universe is a family. And so it's hard to talk about a family. So we talk about he, right? But we're referring to the Godhead that chose to have children, had never had children before, had lived in eternal life, totally happy and content, and out of an abundance of desire to share, makes humanity. And so now all humanity is made with hope. The hope that we become part of the family of God, and that we'd get to participate in the joy of this familial life. But yet things can go sideways, and so sideways that God doesn't even like us. And these are the kings that Christ isn't coming down out of the heavens to go meet just his beloved. He's coming down out of the heavens because he's ready. His patience has ended. Mm-hmm. And he's going to make things right, not because he's so angry, even though I think there is anger, but because he's just over it. And now it's time to usher in the kingdom of God. And this is now the family that is left. Is my sense of what this passage means. And so what it reminds me is that there are no rules that are above God. All rules, as we know them in the universe, are emanating from the heart of God. And so the heart of God is the only thing that ultimately matters. And so God will either look upon you and be like, you have become the kind of being that I've hoped you would become. Or he will look upon us, again, I'm using plural, and say, I don't even want to know you.
Yeah, two difficult scenarios, especially that second one. Mm-hmm. What a beautiful recognition that, God has a heart for us, and he has a dream for us.
He has a dream for all of us, yeah.
In life, there's so many different ways of living, and so many different ways that we decide to get into different actions. For me, it was a mystery when I studied anthropology, and I recognized that the will, our will, it's moved not because of whims, but it's moved because of motivations. Mm-hmm. We move towards something that I am motivated towards. And to recognize that God has made us with a dream to be happy. Mm-hmm. It's a beautiful recognition there that I've got to put this motivation to be happy forever, to be with him forever, so as to move my will to be with this heart that has emanated, as you said so well, right? All the different laws that exist in all of creation and all of the universe. There was a recent publication as well that came from our Holy Father, Pope Francis, and he talked about the heart, and also this devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. How much good it does for each one of us to recognize that someone loves me unconditionally. How much we need that as a basis to be able to live rightly, as almost like a motivation as well to do what is right. And I think in our worlds today, to be able to respond properly to this incredible gift of freedom that God has given us, the freedom to choose good or evil, the freedom to choose, in a certain sense, eternity of happiness or not, we need to be recognized and respond from love. And so we've got this incredible opportunity in our lives to open ourselves that there is someone that loves me unconditionally and that allows me as well to use properly my freedom.
What do you think it means, though? I've struggled to figure out what God loving us unconditionally might mean, because it doesn't seem like God actually loves us unconditionally, in the sense that we can become the kind of beings that God despises. So it's not that there are things that we can do and we can become the kind of beings that God no longer actually likes. And is there a distinction between unconditional love and the kind of beings that God actually likes? Because somehow God gets to a point where he gives up on some of us, or all of us, or us individually. Any of us could face that. What is that? How do you think that works? Like, how does unconditional love sit next to this seemingly undeniable truth that God eventually loses hope in people?
Yeah. So the way that I would put it, Ryan, is that so God, he always unconditionally loves us. At the same time, one of the manifestations of that unconditional love is the freedom that he's offered me.
Yeah.
And so even though he's going to be there throughout all of my life to welcome me back after I've gone astray, and our Catholic tradition, Christian tradition, we have this beautiful passage of the merciful Father, the prodigal son, as it's called sometimes. And even though we've squandered all the gifts that God has given us, we've gone and we've lived a dissolute life, God is always waiting there with an incredible heart, because he loves us so much, to welcome us back. So I would say that God, he never gives up hope on us. But at the same time, mysteriously, he also respects the freedom that he's given us as one of these manifestations of unconditional love. Part of the difficulties of that true gift of freedom, not a fictional freedom or a facade of freedom, but a true freedom, is that someone can say, I want to be outside of that love of God forever. And that's scary. Not God that gives up hope, but rather God that loves us so much to give us the freedom to make a definitive choice, kind of like these perpetual vows that we make.
In reverse, right? Perpetual vows in reverse.
That's right. That's correct. So that's the way that I would put it. God is unconditional, always waiting within time to be able to welcome us back. But there comes a moment when each one of us who are free makes a free choice. Do I accept God and his pardon and his love and his mercy, or do I desire to stay outside of it? In this life, God will always be open, waiting for us to come back. Another passage of the gospel, how many times, Lord, right, should I forgive my brother? And Jesus says, Peter, you should forgive him 70 times, 7 times, which is to say a perfect or an infinite number of times. So as to say as well, God is available and interested in also doing the same for each one of us. So it's more us with the poor use of our freedom that can limit ourselves or exclude ourselves from God's love. He respects that.
But where does God's anger come into play? Like, and God's disappointment and God's genuine dislike?
Yeah, great question. So I think definitely every time that we use our freedom, which is not for our own true good, I think he's sad. I think he's hurt. Mm-hmm. I think he's definitely angry with all manifestations of evil, not with individuals who perhaps many times are acting out of passions, wounds, not acting out of true malice, but rather through no fault of their own. And so I believe it's more of God's sadness in these moments. But when there is a manifestation of true evil through the evil spirits, the temptations as well, for example, I don't know, you could say nuclear war as an example, homicide, which is unjust as well. I think God is angry at those moments through the evil that's caused, and through perhaps as well the devil. Well, definitely through the devil that is also there transforming, tempting, and leading people to do these poor actions. So definitely God has these different passions towards evil. Sad towards individuals, angry towards a poor use of freedom, and also towards all of the different spirits of evil.
Yeah, so you think God hates the devil?
This is an interesting way that you put it there. I think definitely. Yeah, let me think about how to put this in an appropriate way. I think God hates evil.
Does evil is evil personified?
Yes. Yes.
Mm-hmm. So if you are personified evil, God hates you
as a spirit, because again, as a particular individual in this life, we're always open for that capacity for God to be able to renew us. Mm-hmm. So even for an individual, for example, who through no fault of their own perhaps is possessed, right, by an evil spirit, I don't believe that God hates that person at all. Yeah, I think he has pity on that person. Whereas to the evil spirit, he has more of a spirit of anger, of hatred towards that.
Do you think human beings can become the level of evil that the evil spirits are?
In this life, there, I believe, is a war that's happening. Mm-hmm. And many individuals can give in to the temptations of the evil spirit, to becoming perpetually, in the sense, locked in to being like an evil spirit during this life. I believe that there's a distinction that's there that needs to be made. So even the worst person, or that has committed the worst actions in this life, I believe that there's possibility for redemption. And at the same time, there's a moment as well which is definitive, which God himself will choose. So technically or theologically speaking, definitely there is a distinction between a pure spirit, which would be an angel or a demon, and an individual as well, which is not pure spirit. And so in that sense, pure evil, I wouldn't go so far as to say there's an individual today that is pure evil, that is outside of the possibility of redemption. That's the beautiful good news, that God is here to come to save, that he desires as well to free us from evil, even though there's a battle that's going on.
But yet there will, at some point, if there isn't today already, there is a time that will come where, for whatever reasons, God will allow people to become the fullness of what they are, and that might be something so evil God hates it.
Definitely. Yeah. Definitely. And there's different passages there in Scripture as well that talks about the end of the world, where Jesus himself, he does this judgment and he separates the sheep from the goats. And, different passages that are difficult. Jesus himself, sometimes he says, the road to perdition is wide and many take it. And the world and the road to salvation is narrow and few take it. And so Jesus, he talks about what is coming, and definitely we're here today, I think, to be able to help one another as well, to use our freedom appropriately, to come close as well to this incredible God who loves us, but then as well to recognize that there is the possibility of a definitive life that's not one of bliss.
Well, all of this, I think you've done a wonderful job in emphasizing that happiness is actually the core driver for the pursuit of God, in that it's when you realize or when you start to have vision for the notion that my greatest and deepest happiness could only be found by knowing God, that's real spirituality. That's where real spirituality begins. It doesn't mean that you have achieved that level of happiness or achieved that level of intimacy with God or found that the healing that might have to take place. There's a whole bunch of other things. There's a whole journey that people have to go on. But I truly believe the true spiritual journey begins the moment somebody wakes up and says, my deepest happiness could only be found with God.
Truly. And many times that's something which is provoked as well by God. He gives us an experience. He gives us a taste. Mm-hmm. And then we recognize there's nothing in this world that can satisfy me if it's not him. Yeah. Many of the lives of many men and women of spirituality, saints as well, have explained to us about this relationship, this experience of God, and everything else becomes tepid. Nothing else that the world offers comes close to what he can offer. And when I experience a split second of that happiness, I should give up everything, and I'm moved to give up everything to be able to have that for all eternity. As a man that I met once, he had a spiritual experience. He was out in California, and he said, Father, I had an experience of heaven, and then I had an experience of hell. And he goes, my experience of heaven was the most incredible happiness with the man who was there, Jesus Christ. And I was just totally polarized by this, 5-second experience of what heaven was. And then he had an experience as well, unfortunately, of what hell was. And he said, Father, the most difficult part of what I recognized to be this experience of hell was that I was not able to be with that person that loved me so much. Again, mysteriously, happiness, which God can provoke that we experience, and it's the driving factor.
Yeah, my sense about heaven and hell in that regard, or at least in a relational sense, is that heaven is the ultimate place of relationality, where there is love and joy and abundance and sharing, community, both between the Godhead and an individual and amongst all the individuals who are part of this celebration, this joy, this amazing community. And that the opposite is true about hell, is that it's an alone place for a being that wasn't meant to be alone.
Totally. There's different images that we have in our traditions as well, Ryan, and images of heaven and of hell. One of them that has always struck me was the image of this eternal banquet, the same exact scene in heaven and in hell. An incredible table filled up with abundant foods and drink, long instruments, forks and knives, and what's happening in the scene of hell, individuals are starving with this incredible succulent food in front of them because they're trying to take these long forks and put it into their own mouths, but it's too long and they can't. And so they're in front of all of this. They're not eating with their hands. I guess that's the rule in this image. And they're starving because they just can't feed themselves with these long forks. And the image of heaven is exactly the same. But instead of trying to feed themselves, heaven is about feeding the person that's in front of them instead of themselves. Anyway, tons of different images in our tradition of what heaven and hell is. Definitely a place of eternal bliss to motivate us. But then at the same time, as Michelangelo has in the Sistine Chapel, his Last Judgment, other ominous scenes to be able to motivate us through fear, even though I believe it shouldn't be the principal motivator, but definitely as well to have this defensive motivation that's there to not be into this place of eternal damnation and, unfortunately, a lack of love.
Okay, so let's circle back for a minute. When did you end up in Rome? You live in Rome.
That's right.
Tell me a little bit about how you ended up in Rome and what you do in Rome today.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. Well, I've been to Rome a couple of times. Both times was just through my vow of obedience. I said yes blank check, whatever, whenever, however. And my superiors, a couple of different times, they sent me to Rome. Firstly in 2004 for my philosophy, and then as well 2008 for my theology studies. And I've stayed there since 2008. And for us, it's a beautiful grace as a priest to be able to study in Rome. I remember the first time as a college student being there in St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican and sitting in one of the services and just, saying to God kind of in my heart, I just love to live here, get to know all of these beautiful parts of the church and of the Vatican and of the city of Rome. And God has a great sense of humor. So I've been living in Rome since 2008. Had to twist my arm. I said, okay. So always responding to my vow of obedience, living and serving in different types of missions since my priestly ordination was back in 2011.
Okay, 2011.
Yeah. And since then, I've served in different roles. Right now, I'm serving in our general house of our order, and I serve our general overseeing one of our missions of evangelization. And we've got a lot of different types of evangelization. We've got schools, we've got universities, we help to form young people, we help to form adults as well. And the particular area that I have right now where I'm serving is how we're helping to accompany, form, and launch leaders of society so they may put their talents to the service of God and of others and may make a positive impact for the transformation of our world and of our culture. So
does that have something to do with what I know you just came from Texas and you were telling me a little bit about it sounded like a lay society.
Yes, Ryan. It did have something to do with that. One of the manifestations or an institution that we have, which is directly connected to this mission, is an institute called Lumen Institute. And it was founded about 20 years ago by a priest and a couple of business leaders out in New York. And the institutes today, taken from individuals from different places of the culture and of our society, unites leaders who are desirous and taking their faith and as well their leadership capacities to another level. And so the members of this Lumen Institute, they commit to doing monthly spiritual coaching to come together with other leaders as well and talk about the growth of virtues and also what they're called to do with their leadership capacities in serving and transforming the world. So it was a beautiful international summit that we had in Houston just a few days ago. Incredible. The individuals that are there that are living out with great faith and generosity, their leadership and this culture, desiring and surely doing, making an impact and a change.
Sounds like a brotherhood order light. Is that a fair way to characterize something like that?
I guess that's one way of putting it. Calling it a brotherhood, I think it's beautiful because it's a community. You're not alone. At the same time, it's not so formal, and so it's light in as much as you don't take vows, you don't take promises. But definitely, I would say, it's a brotherhood that we're called to be as human beings. We're not alone, and we can do so much together to be able to impact the world for the good. We can inspire one another together. And there's so many organizations that are doing this. This is one of those organizations, but it's a good way to put it.
What's your sense, and we're gonna move toward wrapping up, but I've got one last kind of train of thought I want to explore a little bit, which is, what's your sense about how Christendom can come back together institutionally? Right? We've had so much splintering, obviously, of the great schism between the East and the West, and around 1050, and then you have the Reformation that leads to the splintering thousands of times of different sects inside of Christianity. How does Christendom come back together?
That's a big question, Ryan.
It's huge, obviously. Yeah.
One word: love. What did the first Christians say? Or those that were observing the Christians, you'll know they're Christians by their love. Love is the answer. Love has many manifestations. Perhaps one of the manifestations that I would see as part of this response is also listening. Love is interested in knowing where the other person is coming from. And within Christendom, within the different perhaps divisions that we've had through the centuries, perhaps there's been a lack of understanding and there needs to be more listening. Where my brothers or my sisters are coming from. I think definitely the Holy Father, Pope Francis, he's trying to do that. He's trying to create a church which is more open, listening, and to enter into dialogue. I can't enter into dialogue if I'm not truly open to listen. I can tell a story, and I'd love to share this with a pilgrimage that we did recently to the Holy Land about a year ago, a little bit more than a year ago. And it was with 6 different Christian traditions. The Roman Catholic tradition, we had the Greek Melkite tradition, the Syriac Orthodox, the Coptic Orthodox, we had the Armenian Orthodox tradition. And in a lot of places in the world, also in addition to that, in the Holy Land, it's not always easy to be able to listen among and between these different traditions. But it was a beautiful experience where we were able to sit down together, speak about what we're doing, and listen to the other. Sharing a meal together as well without an agenda, and recognizing that my brother who knows the person of Jesus Christ is interested in sharing his love with the whole world, and that perhaps through the centuries we've caused a lot of different types of divisions. So I would say that is one of my stabs at a first step. Listening with attentive love, and then having a desire to grow and build something together. There's a lot of work for us to do, but thanks be to God, we're not alone. We've got a brotherhood. We've got as well the love of Christ that desires, and this dream that he also says in the Gospel of St. John, that they all be one. This great dream of the heart of Christ, that we come together as brothers and sisters, advance through the listening of our differences, and hopefully can come to agree as well as sharing a more common path towards happiness.
What a wonderful way to end. Father, thank you so much for being here. I'm thrilled that you stopped in Atlanta and spent some time with us.
Ryan, thank you so much for your guiding, for your friendship, and for your interest. Thank you for your love. And I know that will continue in all these different podcasts and your relationships, and that will change the world.
Would you like to give a blessing to the listeners?
I would love to, Ryan. We open ourselves in a spirit of silence to receive God's blessing. Heavenly Father, we call you Father because everything has come from you, and we ask for your blessing to come and descend through all of space, all of those that are listening right now from around the world, so that we may experience your blessing and your fatherly presence. You are the presence of love, and we need that love. We need the love of a loving Father who is there with us as a foundation and as someone as well that encourages us to go and to share our talents, serving others. May your blessing come down upon us and remain with us forever. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen. What a great podcast. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ryan.
This has been the Blackhall Podcast. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Thanks for listening.